Welcome, book lovers. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out, a series where we talk with emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We have a lot of exciting books and authors coming your way this fall. Next up, we'll chat with Elizabeth Gonzalez-James and Ferdia Lennon. But today, my guest is Essie Chambers, and we will be discussing her brand new debut novel, Swift River. I absolutely loved this book, and I am so excited to talk to Essie. Essie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so happy to be here. And thank you to NHPR and Howe Library, too.
So there is a lot to unpack in this novel. Swift River is about a 16-year-old Diamond who is the only Black person in the town of Swift River, and she hates it as much as it hates her. Her mother is a drug addict who can't pay the bills, and making things even worse, Diamond is buried in an obese body she can't escape, a symbol of the generational trauma that weighs on her every single day. Swift River focuses on 3 generations of women in one family, the trauma they endure and pass on. And it also shows us the hope that Diamond holds for the future, and a historic setting in a northern, that's right, I said northern, sundown town, a town where Black people are only allowed to pass through during the day. Essie, there is a lot to talk about here.
Tons, yes.
So let's start in the beginning. Swift River opens with the reader learning that Diamond's father disappeared at the river one day. He's just gone. Nobody knows if he's dead, if he's murdered. They don't find the body. And I kind of wanted to start with that and talk about the father, but I really, really want to start by talking about sundown towns. Because every time I bring this up with someone, they say, oh, that must be in the South, right? Sundown towns were a Southern thing. And I have to correct them right away. And I say, no, this book is set in 1987 in the North. We are in Massachusetts in a sundown town. So please tell us, what is a sundown town?
Yeah, no, it's every time I speak in front of a group of people, I met with gasps. They either don't know what sundown towns are, or they don't understand that this is not a Southern thing. I myself thought I understood what a sundown town was. Just very basically, it's a town where it's all white by design. There are no people of color. Often they're allowed to kind of pass through during the day, but when they first began, I would say probably 1890s all the way through the late 1960s is when most of them were formed. And they keep people of color out either with laws and ordinances or violence and terror. And often there would be a sign, many signs, but often right next to the welcome sign that said, person of color, you are free to pass through this town during the day, but if you were caught after the sun sets, you will be hurt or killed. And so that is where the sundown part of this name came from.
Wait, it says that on the sign going into the town?
It would say, N-word, you are welcome to pass through, but you better be out by the time the sun sets. There would be like a picture of a noose.
Wow.
Yeah. So I made this discovery. There's this book called Sundown Towns, A Hidden History of American Racism. And I discovered this book when I was doing research. I was trying to sort of create a history for the father character based in real history. And I wasn't finding much about Black communities in rural New England in the early 20th century, not surprisingly. And so I stumbled across this book. And if you can believe it, it is, I think, the only book on the history of sundown towns that exists. There are pieces of sundown history that exist in other books that we've seen it in movies and in literature, but it is the only deeply researched piece of work on the history of sundown towns. And so this man, he's since passed away, but he'd gone to great lengths to document even current day sundown towns. And he uncovered that, like, you go in the woods and some of these signs still exist in places. So the discovery that I made is that I, like you, thought sundown towns were a Southern phenomenon. And it turns out they are primarily in the North, not also in the North, but primarily in the North and the Midwest and the Northwest. And so that really blew my mind and really sort of got me thinking. I mean, I immediately knew that I would make this town a sundown town, and I would get to play with this idea of our assumptions about race and racism in the North versus the South. And what that experience was like for a group of Black people who lived and thrived and then were gone.
Wow. So have you ever seen one of these signs? Have you ever come across one?
No, I've never seen one of these signs. But I did discover that, I made 2 discoveries in the course of researching this book. One is that the town next to where I grew up is thought to have been a sundown town. And then the other is, and this happened after the book came out, I was sort of trying to write an essay that pulled on my own growing up experience, and especially when I discovered that I lived so closely to that sundown town, and how did it haunt the whole area. And I discovered that there was a Black community that once lived in my town, which I had no idea about. I mean, when I grew up, we were one of very few people of color there. And so I discovered there had once been a Black community, and there was a Black church. And then they also, I don't want to say they disappeared all at once, but they were gone by the time that my family and I moved there in the 70s. And the more that I talked to this historian who was giving me this information, and we were looking at census data, the more that we came to think that perhaps something did happen. And it has markings of sundown town, although no one has ever sought to prove this. So it's possible that I wrote an entire book that actually mirrored my own life without knowing it.
That's unbelievable. Wow.
Incredible. Yes.
Wow. So Essie Chambers, you grew up in Massachusetts, next door to a sundown town. So what was it like to discover that?
There were things that made sense. I mean, I experienced racism in my hometown, but I felt it more acutely in the town that was next door, and there were even fewer people of color there. So other than a general sense that you have when Black people will tell you, it's like you go to certain places and some places feel safer than others, that definitely felt like a less safe place. It's very different now, but when I was growing up, it didn't feel quite as safe.
So I understand that while you were researching this book, Swift River, you started to understand the phrase or the meaning of "don't play outside after dark." And that sort of resonated with you as a part of your childhood and something that was ingrained in you and your parents. You sort of realized that was because you had grown up next to a sundown town. Is that right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, in part, absolutely. My father, who is a Black American, and, he grew up when there was segregation, and both my parents were in the civil rights movement. They met in the civil rights movement. So, being in this town where we were this mixed race family and stood out, and we're both part of the community, but also kind of, aliens at the same time. I think, and then this is the case in many places in America, obviously, that as a Black man, he understood like where it was not safe. And my siblings and I always felt a kind of intense protectiveness around being out after dark, honestly. And we just thought it was our dad being who he was. And I think that I didn't understand until later in life how terrifying the idea was for him. He didn't know that. None of us knew the sundown town piece of it, but I think it's just a part of being a Black American in a community like that, where all places are not safe places for your children.
I want to go back to this idea that maybe you wrote a novel that mirrored your real life and what you're talking about here about not playing after dark. It's not like any of this was explicit in your childhood, and yet it is in your blood to feel this way. And maybe like Diamond, who's the main character in your novel, Swift River, maybe she was in your blood too? Do you feel that way?
I do. I think, as most fiction authors say over and like, this is not, this is fiction, this is not. But her voice has been with me for a very long time. And I think that her sense of isolation and alienation, I am pulling from my life experience. I mean, I always like to say, it's like most of the details are made up, but the emotional engine underneath everything comes from my life. And Diamond in particular, I grew up, I had friends, we had a community, but there were so many ways, I like to say like we experienced kind of like a soft bigotry that was everywhere. And it was much worse for my brother growing up as a young Black boy and then, young Black man. So I had a very different experience where I was needing to love and depend on people who hurt me in very small ways all the time. It's microaggressions. It's, when I read Claudia Rankine's book, Citizen, it kind of, that really blew my mind open. And this idea that you are moving through a world with people who you love, who are saying incredibly hurtful and harmful things. And with Diamond, I very much exaggerated all of that. She doesn't have any friends. But this idea that going back to safety, the emotional safety, there are no safe places for her, whether it's teachers and the kind of the bigotry of low expectations, or it's the overt racism that she and her mom are experiencing, or it's just, the subtle digs and the general sense that they're not welcome. They're not of that place. And so it's an insider-outsider thing. that I think is very disorienting. And particularly as she makes a friend for the first time, I was pulling from my experience of that insider-outsider thing of like being a part of this community, but at the same time, just never feeling quite of it.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Essie Chambers, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Essie's brand new novel, Swift River. And right now we're digging into the main character, Diamond. She's 16 years old. The book opens in 1987, and she is the only Black child in an all-white town. And her Black father is missing, and so she's growing up with her white mother. So she is literally the only person of color in this entire town. I'd really love to hear your voice. Could you read a page for us?
I would love to. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 1 that comes after the prologue. 1987. The summer after I turned 16, I am so fat I can't ride my bike anymore. So I let it get stolen on purpose. You got a new boyfriend? Ma yells out the living room window, laughing through her smoker's cough when she sees me lying on the ground in front of our house, wrapped around the bike with a bucket and a cleaning rag. I ignore her and she leaves me be, puffing away on her Newports, a faceless blob in the dirty window screen. The whole house looks like it's having a cigarette. It's hot out, and the bike is fiery from lying in the yard all morning. I'm curled around the frame so I can get to all of its parts. It's the only position my body will allow. I scrub at the street grime until a bright red frame pokes through for the first time in years. It mocks the rest of the junk around it. Skeleton lawn chairs, broken push mower, Pop's dead car in the driveway. You trapped under there? Ma shouts as she watches me struggling to stand. She is testing my forgiveness with her stupid jokes. An hour ago, she told me she got herself fired again, this time for telling off her boss at the fertilizer store after he refused to pay for another sick day. Now we will have to live off my check from the TP Motel, the same job she had when I was little. I keep reminding her that we'll have to choose between electricity and heat once the winter comes. But she tells me not to worry myself, that adults plan things and their kids don't always have to know about it. I have my ways, she sings from her crater in the couch.
Just beautiful. Thank you. Let's talk a little bit more, Essie, about what it feels like. You really put her in an extreme situation and to make her an outsider. So can you tell us a little bit more about that setting and what you were thinking as you wrote that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. One of the first images that came to me, I am a very visual writer, was this image of Diamond and her mother on the side of a road. They don't drive, so they hitchhike everywhere they go, which makes them extra vulnerable. As you can imagine, this, she's in this bigger body and this little skinny white mother, and they are having to depend on the kindness of strangers in this unkind town. And so I understood early on, I knew I wanted to tell an outsider story. I knew I wanted the central question to be this idea of a young girl who's just trying to be a teenager and all the, and wants to have crushes on boys and hang out with friends, but she is always just metaphorically had her face pressed up against a window. She's never really had a friend before. And so first started writing the book, which was more of a coming of age book. I knew that her journey would be, am I going to leave or am I going to stay in this town? And so a lot of these forces that are pressing up against her are what are propelling her to want to go. And so you have, they are, as you said, they are grieving the loss of this father. They're living in poverty.
I really love that you plop Diamond into this situation where she is just, she's having a horrible time. Her father is missing, probably dead, maybe ran away. We don't really know. She doesn't have friends. Her mother, they have no money. They're in a house that's falling apart. You really take everything away from her and strip it down. And then you go even another level down. And we see that on her father's side, she doesn't know anything about her family history. And on her mother's side, she can go back a lot further. But with her father's side, she knows nothing. And I understand that also really parallels your own family history. And I just wanted to dig into that a little bit and ask why you wanted to make that distinction or make that so clear. Why was that an important part of Diamond?
Well, just to speak to my own history, my mother's white and my father's Black. And on my mother's side of the family, we can go so far back. I can trace my lineage to a Scottish king. There's a founding father that I'm connected to. There are old, centuries old paintings on our wall, and you see someone's wearing a brooch and like, I have the brooch. You know, we just have all of these things that when you look on my father's side of the family, I can only go back as far, you know, as a couple of grades, and we have one name of someone who is possibly an enslaved man. And so, you know, this is the case with most African Americans, where it's a haunted sense of not knowing exactly where you come from. And I thought it would be interesting with Diamond. She has her mother and her mother's white family, but is rootless in the sense of not knowing anything about her father's family, and not knowing anything about Black people. I mean, what she knows about Black people comes from Black sitcoms and you know, sort of popular Black culture. So I know that I, at a certain point, went on my own journey of discovery and sort of the horror of understanding. I think right around the time I was first writing the Clara parts of the book, which I'll talk about in a bit, my younger sister, who has since passed away, but she was doing a lot of doing the family genealogy. And she was the first to make all of these discoveries, and that she just got stuck on my father's side. And at the same time, my father, my late father, had Alzheimer's. And so I became acutely aware of this idea that he was the last person alive in our family to have been alive during segregation, when, you know, to have married my mom when it was still illegal in most places. And this idea that we were going to lose a piece of our history when he went and when his mind went. I just felt this kind of urgency around preserving stories and family stories. And I wanted to infuse that feeling of being filled up with family stories, not having had them in Diamond, and have that be part of her journey, and something that gave her a kind of personal power that she so desperately needed.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You are listening to Check This Out, New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Essie Chambers, and we are talking about her brand new novel, Swift River. Essie, we were just talking about family lineage and that need or that desire to look into your past and to find it, and what happens when the ends of the generations die out or they lose their memory and you don't really know, you don't have that family history anymore. We see your main character, Diamond, is in that situation. And all she has left of her family on her father's side are these letters that she starts getting and she finds. Let's talk about Diamond and these letters and her family history.
Sure. I think at a certain point, you know, when I started writing this book, it was a coming of age book. And the more that I figured out what Diamond needed, and these layers came, and when I discovered this sundown town history, there was a passage in the book that I mentioned before, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. And it was about how sometimes in these sundown towns, there was an exception made, and one or two Black people were allowed to stay, were allowed to live there. And often these were considered like sort of like the town Negroes, and maybe they were domestics or served some sort of essential function to the white community. And it struck me as such a nightmarish kind of position to be in. And I thought, I am going to make my girl Diamond descended from the only young woman allowed to stay behind after the rest of the Black community was violently chased out of Swift River. And so these letters are from this woman named Clara, who stayed behind. She's writing to her sister. And so what I was able to do is I was now telling two levels of story about being the only one in incredibly different ways. So I won't say much more about Clara because I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, so a relative that Diamond has never met named Lena, who was her father's cousin, reaches out and is in possession of some of these letters. And so she starts to send Diamond these letters. And so Diamond is slowly learning about family secrets, learning about the secrets of this town and this hidden history of this town as the book progresses.
So one of the themes that I really loved with these women that you bring in, Lena and Clara, is that Diamond realizes that actually her relative, Clara, literally was a midwife to most of the people living in Swift River. And so she has this moment of realization where she's walking around thinking almost everyone around her owes their life to her relative, and yet they treat her like trash. They treat her horribly. And I just thought that was a beautiful way of putting out that theme and that juxtaposition. And I was dying to ask you about, what are you thinking about? What were you thinking when you made that happen? Just wow.
Thank you. No, I think the choice to make Clara a midwife, I I needed to find a reason for her to have stayed behind that made sense. That why she sort of let her family, everything that connected her to the world, leave and go back down south in this kind of reverse migration. And so I created this fiction that she was working for a doctor, and that the doctor was making promises that he would send her to medical school if she continued on working for him. And I did a ton of research on midwifery and the powerful role that midwives played then and now, And so Clara had her own journey as a midwife and sort of taking over for this doctor. But I was really interested in this juxtaposition of this woman who had all of this power in this town, and because she was the one that was helping bring life to everyone who lived there, who was bringing babies into the world. And she talked about this experience that she had of being sort of essential to white people as someone who was caring for their health, but at the same time completely invisible. I don't know. I just thought that was an interesting dynamic to play with, and for Diamond to understand, again, this sort of insider outsider thing, where the idea of being in a place but being, no matter what, being completely invisible.
It was just fascinating. So I want to move on and talk about Diamond's father. When the book opens, her father is not there. We don't know if he's dead or if he's disappeared. And there are all sorts of rumors. People say they saw him here or there. And Diamond often just says they just saw a black man and call it her father, right? She doesn't believe. She thinks that her father is actually dead. And it matters because at 7 years, she and her mother can collect this insurance money. And they're just coming up on the 7-year anniversary of his disappearance or his death. So in a sense, he's not really a character in the book. We don't see him in the present day moments. And yet he hangs over every single scene. And I kept saying, does it even matter if he's dead or gone? Does the difference matter? Because he's just so important anyway. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. He was originally in an earlier version of the book, he did have his own chapters. One of my early readers said to me, he kind of hasn't earned his place in this book. And I realized I wasn't nailing his voice. And this story is about the women. This is the women in this family. It belongs to them. And he was much more impactful as someone who was haunting the story, to your point. And so where I placed him was, in this sort of mystery that hovered over her present day. But then I added an entirely other layer to the story where it's essentially starts the 7 years before this present day moment, the year before he disappeared, so that I could set up what was happening as this man was sort of falling apart. And what was so kind of liberating for me as a writer is to be able to do that through the eyes of a 9-year-old little girl, where there's a lot that the reader understands that she doesn't understand, but I could tell the story in a much more sort of poetic way, where we are walking with her through her sensory experiences, her emotional discoveries, and that moment when your parents come to life in a way that you understand who they are. And so for that to be happening to her in a moment where her father is really coming apart and their lives are coming apart. And so we get to see all of the things underneath that happened leading up to the present day moment.
It was so powerful. And the Diamond's father was not physically there from the present day, and yet he was haunting the entire book. I just kept wondering, does she even care if he's disappeared or if he actually is dead? Because he's not in her life. So for herself, she wants to move on. The whole goal of the book is that Diamond wants to get out of Swift River. She's trying to get her driver's license so she can literally drive away. So does she even care if her father is dead or just gone?
It's a great question. I mean, early in the story, I'm sort of setting up the fact that the father is gone, and she and her mother are mourning in very different ways. The mother character kind of wants to move on, sort of put it in the closet and move on, and she likens it to kind of being stuck in the mud and just wanting to let it hold her, because if he's merely left them, that is its own kind of heartbreak. And then if he is dead, it's another. And so throughout the book, that is what I am playing with, is like, what kind of leaving are we really talking about? And I think it becomes, I'm not going to say, which it is or, whatever, but it actually isn't important at the end of the day, because it really is just about the fact that in his absence, she is learning what happened to him that is incredibly important in her understanding of who she is and what it means to be Black in this town and in this world.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Essie Chambers, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, Swift River. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Essie, I am dying to ask you about hitchhiking. So hitchhiking is a really, really big part of this book because Diamond, the main character in Swift River, and her mother have no other way of getting around other than walking. They don't drive. You even take away Diamond's bike. She used to have a bicycle, and you take that away, and she's trying to get her driver's license secretly because her mother doesn't want her to have it. So to get around, they either have friends who pick them up or they hitchhike. Hitchhiking is super dangerous. Can you talk about why you included that and what it means in the book?
Well, it means a bunch of things. I mean, it is that the thing I was saying earlier where, you have these two people who are so vulnerable, having to depend on the kindness of strangers in a town that is not kind to them. And I thought that would be interesting to explore what it means to rely on people in that way when they don't feel safe. And I think the more important part for me is, in many ways, this is a story about parental love and failure. And Ma, as a character who loves her child fiercely, but also is failing her in very profound ways. Hitchhiking to me was sort of emblematic of that. She thinks that she is caring for her child by, no matter what, figuring out a way for them to get to A to B and they have to go to the grocery, but at the same time, she's placing her in harm's way every time they get into a car. I just thought that was an interesting way to explore one of the many ways that she is very much struggling as a parent who is still in mourning, and she goes from one low-paying job to the other. She's just incredibly unstable, and it makes their existence very, very fragile.
So you even wrote out some very clear rules for their hitchhiking, which kinds of cars they would get in or what they'd expect. How did you come up with all of that?
I've never hitchhiked in my life, actually. I had to think back. I think I pulled on, I don't know, I put myself in their shoes. Like, if I am going to be in this town, who are the people that are going to be the scariest to get in a car with? I was always trying to make myself laugh. That was also part of it, is like, what could be both a little bit funny in the tragicomic way and also feel very real. But yeah, I've never hitchhiked before.
I was sure you were an experienced hitchhiker, given all of this.
No, I think probably when it was okay to, I've probably been in cars where we've picked up hitchhikers before. And, I don't know, I just remember going on long family trips and seeing hitchhikers on the side of the road and just thinking how, I don't know, maybe both fun and thrilling it might be, but also at the same time terrifying, not knowing what you were going to get.
So there are a lot of really heavy, dark themes in your novel, Swift River, but also Diamond, she's going through a lot of hard stuff, but she's also kind of a little strange, a little bit of a weirdo, coming of age. She's funny. There's this other lighter side to her. And you mentioned you sort of made yourself laugh as you were writing. So I would love to hear you talk about her lighter side and the lighter side of Diamond.
That was incredibly important to me. I had a Post-it on my computer at all times that said, "Tell the truth and make yourself laugh." And I did feel like at first that was for me as a writer, and then it became, that's Diamond as well. Because of just the heaviness in the book, it was essential for me that I have a person carrying that pain also with joy. And the key to me was in the specifics and in her filter and the way that she saw the world. I didn't want to just make her like the funny fat girl. It had to be about this filter that was like so singular. And so what she saw and how she saw it and her thoughts about people and her interactions with people. I mean, I went to great pains to feel fun and light, because I also think that that's the way we experience life. Joy and pain live so close together. And I wanted, even on a page, for people to have that entire range of emotions.
You said you didn't want to make her the funny fat girl, but why did you make Diamond so heavy? She weighs almost 300 pounds in the book.
A couple of reasons. I did want to play around with her as an outsider and not always knowing whether or not her rejection was about race or her size. I thought that was interesting. And the diamonds of the world who look like that and moving through the world in that kind of a body, they're not centered in stories. And if they are often tropes. And so it was really important to me to give a character like her dimension. I also felt, I don't think I knew this consciously, but at a certain point I realized that based on my own experience, the way that you survive in a community like this where it's incredibly important, you want to feel like you belong to these people, is that when you are faced with these moments where the microaggressions and small daily wounds, you have to kind of swallow them in order to keep moving. So the idea of all of this swallowing, and there's a very key scene in the book that I won't give away now where you kind of see her switch from having this voice and expressing pain and understand that wasn't okay to confront the things that she was up against. And so that is when swallowing her pain with food began. I've struggled with my weight my entire life. And so I understand what that means. And I wanted to have a character in a bigger body where the journey wasn't about her losing weight. This is a 3-month time period in the present day. It's a very compressed period of time. And the changes that are happening are internal and they're massive and they're not about her body.
I really couldn't think of too many other books. I could only think of maybe one or two where I've seen such a large woman as the main character. And I love that you wrote it not as her journey to lose weight and change her body, but as her journey to get out of Swift River, the town, get that driver's license, and also to make a friend. So you really threw Diamond a lifeline with her friend Shelley, and you gave her sort of this hope and this lightness of she could have a friend, she could find something else in her future. Tell us about Shelley and that friendship.
Oh, Shelley was so fun to write. I mean, Shelley was also kind of an outsider. On the face of it, her outsiderness came from the fact that, as Diamond would describe, she is seen as a slutty slut in the school. And of course, there are all these other layers to Shelley that Diamond discovers. And I don't know, I just thought it was so interesting, the idea that this is her first friend that she's ever had, and to show what that experience is like when you first form a connection with someone. And then at the same time, Shelley becomes her safe place. And they are doing crazy things, and they're going through an insane experience in driver's ed. It is kind of crazy, the right turn that takes. But at the same time, yeah, she's learning what it means to kind of drive around town on a Friday night and looking for guys and just regular teenage stuff. And at the same time, Shelley doesn't always do and say the right things in terms of race. She's got the bigotry that is all over this town, and you're seeing Diamond figure out. She's registering these small wounds and then figuring out how to move forward with Shelley and love her in the same time. And I will say primarily she needed lightness and a safe place. And Shelley to me was that space. I wanted their interactions to be funny. They're on an adventure together.
But also, Shelley, I think why she works and why I loved her so much is because on the surface, she's like this slutty slut character. She calls her, she's beautiful, she's white, she seems to have everything. She's this plan, but she actually has a lot of darkness in her. If you scratch that surface, she's a very deep character, and she's actually struggling with a lot.
She is.
Yeah, and Diamond seems to realize that, and that actually helped Diamond, I thought, in a lot of ways.
It did. I mean, I think that was their point of connection, really, is when they understood that they were experiencing pain with parental failure, with their parents letting them down profoundly in different ways, and them sort of parenting themselves, and home being a very fraught place. I mean, Shelley lived in a home with a parent who was a hoarder. Her house was literally stacked to the ceiling with baggage and junk. And so, yeah. And Shelley, I think that the biggest point of connection was this idea that they both wanted to leave. And Shelley had clarity about leaving. And so that seed was planted with Diamond in a way that she hadn't really considered before. Like, oh, are we allowed to leave? Like that small town thing. When you first tune into the bigger world and have to make the choice of whether or not you want to stay in this comfortable place, and the absurdity of Diamond's comfortable place being this town that causes her so much discomfort, or leave and go out in the world and find your place in the world. And Shelley was like, she was on a mission. She was going to get out of that town.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and my guest today is Essie Chambers. We're talking about her brand new debut novel, Swift River. One of the things that I loved about this book was it felt like I was reading a movie, if that makes sense. Like I could see this unfolding on screen. And then I read about Essie Chambers, and I read that she's actually filmmaker, producer. That is where she comes from. Essie, tell us about those roots.
Sure. Yeah, no, I had a whole other life before this. I started off, actually, I was both a TV and a film executive. I kind of grew up and developed my story chops at Nickelodeon and a channel called The N, which was kind of like a channel for teenagers. So we did like Degrassi and South of Nowhere. And the first place where my life in books and my life in television connected was I adapted a book by the brilliant, wonderful Jacqueline Woodson called Miracles Boys. And Jacqueline and I became very good friends, and she's actually responsible for getting me to focus seriously on my writing while I was still a TV executive. So that's side tangential note. But yeah, I had an incredible, creative, inspiring, just thrilling career where I was helping other people tell their stories and very much neglecting my own. And I think it was just creatively satisfying enough that I could ignore the fact that what I really wanted to be doing was writing books, not even writing for television or film. Always wanted to write books. And so, with Jackie's help and at a certain point I went back to grad school, but yeah, so I worked as a television executive and a film executive. And then when I left my last executive job, I went back to grad school, and then I focused on documentary filmmaking. Most recently, I have been a documentary film producer, and I had a doc come out. Kind of like I was planting seeds for years and years and years, and then everything came up at once, as is life. And so right around the time that I sold my novel, my documentary that I was a producer on called Descendant came out, and that was an incredible experience to be navigating both of those things at the same time. It was just wild.
I can't even imagine. You work for years on these things, and then everyone calls you an overnight success.
It's like, yeah, for some people, it's like I was having a midlife crisis or something. I mean, with the book, what's so interesting about it is that, I was the girl that was always working on her novel in a way that, at a certain point, I was like, is this ever going to finish her novel? People stopped asking me about my novel. And I knew, I very much understood that if I did not finish this novel, it would be the greatest regret of my life, without exaggeration. I think I wrote around the edges of my life. Started off, I wrote on scraps of paper, and then I would join this writing group via Jacqueline Woodson, and then it came from the edges to be the center and the thing that I missed the most when I was away from it. And this feeling that I wasn't my creative self anywhere more than I was when I was writing. Writing is the hardest thing, and it's awful and painful and chaotic and all these things, but I was the closest to myself that I've ever been when I was writing. And I told the truth in a way that I wasn't able to anywhere else.
That's beautiful.
Almost 9 years it took me.
Wow. That was my next question. When did you start writing this? When was that first scrap of paper?
I feel like Diamond's voice has been with me always, in a sense. And I don't mean my own voice. I mean Diamond's voice, like her story wanting to come out. And I think the first scrap of paper was in the group that I was in with Jacqueline Woodson. She created a writer's group for all of her friends who, like me, had jobs and did things that made it so they were neglecting their own work. And she was like, I'm going to shut you up. You all are going to get together. We're going to support each other. We're going to write. And so I think it was really the first time that I took myself seriously as a writer, and I acknowledged. I mean, I was an English major in college. It wasn't that I'd never written before, but I could not think of myself as a writer. I couldn't give myself permission to do that. That's when I started writing short stories. So when I left my exec job, and I felt a little rootless. It was sort of like now or never. And that's when I made the decision to go back to grad school. And listen, you don't need a master's to write a book. But for me, what I understood about myself, it was two things. I needed structure, I needed discipline, I needed to answer to people. And I wanted to develop my craft. My teachers were masters. I mean, I had Paul Beatty and Victor LaValle and like Stacey DeRasp. I mean, I just had incredible teachers. And it was the best to go back to school and be the old lady in the class. I'm paying for this. I'm here, and I've lived all of this life, and I have all of these stories to tell. It was the best gift that I have ever given myself. So I think that it was in grad school that that's when a first draft of the book was born. I mean, it was still years after grad school that it took me to finish, but it was just that sense that, I don't know, if not now, when?
So, Essie, while you were writing this book, were you seeing it on a screen? Are you seeing it as a movie?
Not consciously. I think I'm just a very visual writer. I didn't consciously see it as a movie. I very much was, I felt like I had access to resources that could have allowed me to do that, but I always wanted to write books. But it would have been impossible. All of my years of telling stories for the screen, there's a kind of efficiency with which you do a scene where, there's a beginning, middle, and end, and characters have to grow in a certain way. All that stuff I bring into writing, but also just my visual sense. Like, I almost always see something and then I have to figure out what I've seen and what are the emotions behind it and what's happening to the characters. And so it just kind of comes first. And then I love finding the language for what I have seen. I write with poetry next to me and all the authors that I love and all the voices that I want in my head. And particularly writing in first person present, I think that's really hard because you have to sustain a voice for a very long time. But it's also incredibly exciting because you get to move people through a room.
Can you tell me, how is writing for the screen different from writing a book?
How is writing for the screen? I mean, I just think there's a lot more freedom in writing a book. I mean, it's harder in many ways. But actually, it's like harder and easier in different ways for each medium. I mean, when you're writing for the screen, your visuals are doing all the work. What your dialogue is carrying and what the visuals are carrying are different. And sometimes they are at odds. And that's a whole other level. It's how those two things are playing with each other. And you are with a team of people. And so everyone has an essential role, the director being often the most important role, second to the writer, because the director is bringing a whole other level and layer of storytelling to the words that you've created, sometimes that you didn't even expect or know, so it's a team sport. And that was all, that took a lot of getting used to. I had an incredible editor, and my agent is just a genius. I did a lot of editing with her before I sold the book, and both of them brought such wonderful things out of me, but it was still me. But that was terrifying.
I never thought about that difference, that when you're writing for the screen, you really have a whole team. And when you're a writer on a novel, it's literally you at your computer in a room, right?
That's right. I mean, it's on the screen. I mean, you're starting with a script that's just you sitting on a screen. But as it comes to life, the stages that it comes to life, every part that everyone plays is so essential to telling that story and making it alive. Any screenwriter will tell you, a director, an art director, a DP, they all bring it to life in ways that you just could never have expected. And that is what is so wonderful about it.
So you just sort of went quickly over the fact that you worked on this amazing documentary, Descendant, that you were a producer there. This was a really big deal, this show. And of course, it was released by Michelle and Barack Obama's Higher Ground. And you said it so quickly. I just want to go back to that for a minute. What was it like working on Descendant? Did you meet the Obamas?
Oh my gosh, I had dinner with the Obamas.
Oh my God.
No one's ever asked me that before, actually, in an interview. And it feels weird and braggy to say that, but
no, we want to know. This is the good stuff.
President Obama was sitting next to me. Mrs. Obama was across from me. Questlove was also an executive producer on the film, so he was across from. I mean, and it was a very incredible moment, and it was. Oh my gosh! I mean, it was like they are magical beings, and they were incredibly supportive of the film. I met the director, Margaret Brown, at MacDowell, a writer's residency, and I was there working on my book, and she was working on some writing, and we became friends. And she'd been telling stories in that area of Alabama for over a decade, and she was very connected to this community already. And so she'd been shooting a little bit, and so she brought me on, I would say, maybe a year or two after they'd started shooting. And in the beginning, the story was about a slave ship called the Clotilda, which was the last ship to bring kidnapped Africans to America, well, the last documented one, because before the Civil War ended. And the lore around this ship was that a ship's captain and a slave owner made a bet that they could get this one last shipment of humans and not be caught, because slavery was legal, but the slave trade was outlawed. So it was punishable by death. And so they made this bet, and that was how this was all put into motion. And then when they got to Mobile, they burned the ship and sunk the ship to destroy the proof, and then sold these 110 people into slavery. Now, I say lore. I always want to be careful with this language around myths and legend, and because it was not legend or myth to the people who were descended from those folks that were on that ship. And that was a big part of what this story of Descendant was about. On the surface, it was about the search for this ship. At a certain point, people have looked for it on and off through the years, but the search began again in earnest. And so we were documenting the search. Will they find this ship? But really what it was about was this community of people that lived in a place called Africa Town, and they were descended from the original 110 enslaved people. In the most beautiful ways, this film was sort of in conversation with my book, in the sense that oral history and telling the story of what happened to their ancestors is what kept alive this idea that they existed on this ship, because there was no proof. I'm not giving anything away by saying the ship was found not very long into filming. And so the Descendant changed from being, will the ship be found or not, to the focus on these people and their story that they kept alive by telling it for all of these years and generations.
Essie, you are an incredibly accomplished producer and now author. What kind of advice do you have for people who are looking to start writing, either on the television or screen side or on the novel side?
I think the key for me was developing a writing practice. I think the obvious thing is just write, write, write. But for me, it was finding a community of people that I could lean on and they could be my readers. And then developing, I think when you want to write, there's a lot of time spent feeling bad about not writing or feeling bad about not writing enough. And the first step for me was giving myself permission to not accomplish very much, but just to commit to showing up. And so for a very long time, that was what my writing commitment was, as I was going to sit at my desk every day for a fixed period of time, and whatever came out, came out. It didn't have to be a certain number of words. That's what worked for me. And I find that just sort of took away some of that kind of like punishing thing that we do to ourselves that scares us away from coming back. Yeah, committing to showing up and finding a writing community, because it is such a lonely place, is also really important. Find people who you trust who will read your work.
I feel like that's life advice. Commit to showing up.
Commit to showing up. Yeah. I mean, it was so important. I can't tell you how important it was for me, because I kept getting lost. I'm a Virgo. I'm going to agonize over the first sentence of everything. So the only way that I could move through anything is just to not have it be attached to a page count. Not everyone is like that. Some people need to have, I need to write this many words a day, or that, it just didn't work for me as a first step. It's a kind of integrity that you need to develop, where you're keeping a promise to yourself that you're making. I feel like that kind of integrity is really important when you are in the fragile early stages of being an artist. Yeah, show up for yourself.
Essie Chambers, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. I loved this conversation with you, Rachel.
You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howell Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. I'll be back next week with my guest, Elizabeth Gonzalez-James. We'll be talking about her new novel, The Bullet Swallower. Make sure to check this out and join us then. Our producer today is NHPR's Jessica Hunt. The Howell Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by C&S Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howell Library Corporation. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.